The celebratory atmosphere of the dinner party was reaching its peak when my elder sister Cora stood up and raised her crystal wine glass high toward the chandeliers, while declaring with an insufferable smirk that she was officially flipping our family beach house in the Outer Banks for an effortless six-figure profit. I am Harlow, a 32-year-old real estate data analyst who has spent a decade mastering the art of silence, while my family treated me like an invisible background character in my own life story. As Cora continued bragging about how she had already secured the construction permits and nearly finished the high-end renovations, I simply leaned back in my chair and took a slow sip of my vintage red wine because she had no idea that I had quietly purchased that exact property from the bank 10 years ago. My father clapped his hands in approval while my mother beamed with pride at Cora's supposed business brilliance, yet none of them noticed the frantic vibration of my phone or the fact that the primary contractor was currently waiting outside in the driveway with a fury that was about to shatter this entire charade. I watched my sister bask in the unearned glory of a house she never owned, realizing that the web of lies she and her husband had spun was finally stretching to its absolute breaking point tonight. Before we dive deeper into the chaos of my family's betrayal, I would truly appreciate it if you could hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a single update of this unfolding drama. Before moving on with my story, please let me know in the comments what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see just how far my journey has traveled across the world. Your support helps me share these incredible life lessons with everyone, so please consider liking the video and sharing your initial thoughts on Cora's bold claims down below. Growing up in the shadow of a golden child meant that my presence was often measured only by my utility, rather than my worth. My father, Robert, always viewed Cora as the visionary of the family simply because she possessed a loud personality and a talent for spending money that she never actually earned herself. During every Thanksgiving and Christmas, the dinner conversation revolved entirely around Cora's latest failed boutique or her expensive social circle, while my steady career in real estate data was dismissed as a boring clerical job that required no real intelligence. Caleb, her husband, was even worse, as he frequently made snide remarks about my modest apartment and my lack of investment hustle, while he sat there wearing a watch that I knew was bought with my parents' retirement savings. I remember a specific evening a few years ago when I tried to warn my mother about the rising property taxes on the beach house, only for her to pat my hand dismissively and tell me to leave the big financial thinking to Cora. The house in the Outer Banks had belonged to my grandmother, a sanctuary of salt air and cedar shingles that represented the only peace I had ever known, yet the family treated it like a trophy to be handed to Cora as a reward for her constant mediocrity. They never asked how I was doing or if I needed help with my own mortgage because they were too busy subsidizing Cora's delusions of grandeur. My sister would sit at this very table and complain about the maintenance of a property she visited once a year, while I was the one secretly tracking the erosion of the shoreline and the integrity of the coastal pilings. The resentment didn't burn hot. It was a cold, calculated realization that my family would never see me unless I forced them to look at the truth. Even when I helped them navigate the complex probate laws after my grandmother passed, they credited Cora's intuition for the smooth transition. It was during those lonely nights of being ignored that I realized being invisible was actually my greatest strategic advantage. I began to save every penny from my bonuses, living far below my means, while Cora maxed out her credit cards on designer handbags and trips to Tulum. I watched Caleb struggle to keep up with the mortgage on their own suburban home, knowing that their greed would eventually lead them to the only asset left in the family name. The beach house became the ultimate bait in a trap that they were currently setting for themselves, with every boastful word they uttered. I looked at Dad as he beamed at Cora, wondering how he would react when he realized his favorite daughter was nothing more than a common fraudster. My heart didn't ache for their approval anymore. It only beat with the steady rhythm of a clock, counting down to the moment of impact. Cora reached for another bottle of champagne, her laughter ringing like shattered glass in my ears, completely unaware that the foundation of her world was already rotting from the inside out. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I observed my parents admiring Caleb's fake confidence, knowing that their world was about to be rocked by a reality they weren't prepared to face. The sheer injustice of their favoritism had built a wall between us that no amount of forced family dinners could ever dismantle. 10 years ago, the global financial crisis finally caught up with my father's construction business, leaving him with a mountain of debt and a foreclosure notice on the one place that meant everything to us. Dad was too proud to admit he had failed, so he hid the red-stamped envelopes in a drawer and hoped for a miracle that was never going to come. I was only 22 at the time, working 3 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night, but I had access to the public records that showed the bank was mere weeks away from seizing the Outer Banks property. I knew that if I approached Dad directly, his ego would prevent him from taking my money, and Cora would surely find a way to drain the funds before they reached the lender. Instead, I contacted a real estate attorney named Vance and instructed him to set up an anonymous entity called H Anchor LLC to act as a third-party buyer. The day the house went to the courthouse steps for auction, I sat in the back row with trembling hands as Vance placed the winning bid using every cent of my life savings and a high-interest private loan I had secured. My parents were told that a private investor had bought the house, but was willing to let them remain as occupants for a nominal fee that I secretly covered through a series of offshore accounts. For a decade, I watched my family enjoy the ocean breeze, blissfully unaware that the family legacy was actually a line item on my personal balance sheet. I felt a strange sense of power every time I walked across the wooden porch, knowing that I owned the very ground they stood upon while they continued to treat me like a disappointment. Cora would often brag about how the house was hers by right, claiming that she would one day turn it into a luxury rental empire that would make us all rich. I would just nod and smile, thinking about the deed locked in my fireproof safe that bore only my signature. This wasn't about spite back then. It was about preservation, ensuring that the only piece of my grandmother's soul wasn't lost to a bank's ledger. However, as the years passed and Cora's entitlement grew, the act of saving the house transformed into a long-term investment in justice. I watched her and Caleb get deeper into debt, sensing that they were looking for a way to monetize the property they didn't own. They assumed Dad still held the title, and since Dad was getting older and more forgetful, they began to manipulate him into signing documents he didn't understand. Little did they know that Dad had no legal authority to transfer or encumber the property, since the title had been cleared and transferred to my LLC a decade prior. Every time they looked at the ocean from that deck, they were trespassing on my future, and the bill for their arrogance was finally coming due. I had kept the receipts for every tax payment, every insurance premium, and every structural repair building, a fortress of documentation that no amount of Cora's charm could ever penetrate. The secrecy was my only protection against their inevitable exploitation, and I wore it like a second skin. Over the next several years, the cost of maintaining a coastal property in North Carolina became a crushing weight that I carried entirely on my own shoulders while my family lived in blissful ignorance. I spent my weekends analyzing flood zone maps and negotiating with insurance adjusters after Hurricane Dorian battered the coast, ensuring that the roof was replaced and the pilings were reinforced. I remember one specific winter when the HVAC system failed, and instead of asking me for help, Dad called Cora, who told him she was too busy with a high-stakes merger to deal with household trivia. I was the one who drove 4 hours in the middle of a nor'easter to meet the repairman, paying for the $3,000 fix out of my own pocket while pretending the landlord had handled it. My best friend Sloane was the only person who knew the truth, and she often asked me why I continued to play this dangerous game of financial hide and seek. She warned me that people like Cora don't just take an inch. They take the whole mile and burn the bridge behind them once they are finished. I told Sloane that I was waiting for the moment when their greed would finally outweigh their caution, because that was the only way they would truly learn a lesson. I watched from the sidelines as Cora and Caleb began to live a lifestyle that their income couldn't possibly support, leasing European cars and taking first-class flights while their mailbox was filled with past due notices. They viewed the beach house as a dormant gold mine, a stagnant asset that was being wasted by Dad's lack of ambition. I began to notice subtle changes in the way they spoke during our Sunday dinners, with Caleb asking pointed questions about the original deed and whether Dad had updated his will recently. It was nauseating to watch them circle like vultures over a man who wasn't even dead yet, especially since I knew their claws would find nothing but empty air. I spent my nights at my desk meticulously filing every utility bill and maintenance contract under my company name, creating a paper trail that was as ironclad as a bank vault. I even installed a discreet smart security system under the guise of protecting Dad from intruders, which gave me a real-time feed of everyone who entered the property. I saw Cora and Caleb visiting the house when Dad wasn't there, walking around with measuring tapes and taking photos of the kitchen like they were already planning the demolition. They were so blinded by their own reflected glory that they never stopped to wonder why the property taxes were always paid on time, or why the anonymous landlord never raised the rent. Their arrogance was their blindfold, and I was more than happy to let them keep it on until the very last second. Every time Cora called me boring or unambitious, I just thought about the look on her face when she would finally realize that the little sister she pitied was actually the person who held her entire destiny in the palm of her hand. The ocean was the only witness to my planning, and its constant roar kept my secrets safe from the prying eyes of those who only saw what they wanted to see. 6 months before this disastrous dinner party, the situation escalated from mere greed to outright criminal intent when Cora and Caleb decided to move forward with their flip without a single legal right to the house. They managed to convince a local notary who happened to be an old high school friend of Caleb's to certify a forged power of attorney that supposedly gave Cora total control over Dad's affairs. Armed with this fraudulent document, they approached Gary Higgins, a reputable but no-nonsense contractor in the Outer Banks, and promised him a massive payout once the house was sold for a premium. They told Gary that the house was tied up in a family trust and that they were the sole trustees, showing him forged permit approvals that Caleb had crudely photoshopped in his home office. I watched through my security cameras as Gary's crew began to rip out the vintage hardwood floors and the custom cabinetry that my grandmother had handpicked 40 years ago. My heart raced with a mixture of fury and calculated coldness as I saw the history of my childhood being tossed into a dumpster in the driveway. I could have stopped them that first day, but I knew that for the charges to stick and for the lesson to be permanent, I had to let them commit a felony. I waited until they had signed a formal construction contract worth $80,000 with an initial deposit of $15,000 that Caleb had likely stolen from Dad's remaining savings. Gary Higgins was a man of his word, and he poured his heart into the work, believing he was helping a family modernize their heirloom for a new generation. Meanwhile, Cora was busy posting teaser photos on her Instagram, claiming she was the lead designer on a major luxury renovation project. She was building a brand on a foundation of sand, and I was documenting every single lie, every forged signature, and every unauthorized structural change. I consulted with my lawyer Vance, who confirmed that what they were doing was not just a family dispute but aggravated fraud and forgery. We sat in his office looking at the digital evidence, and even a seasoned attorney like Vance was shocked at the sheer audacity of their plan. He asked me if I was ready for the fallout, knowing that this would likely end in a permanent rift and potential prison time for my own sister. I looked him in the eye and told him that Cora had already destroyed our family with her lies. I was simply the one who was going to provide the consequences. I began to receive automated alerts from the county office because my LLC was the registered owner, and any attempt to file legitimate permits was being flagged as fraudulent. Cora and Caleb had bypassed the system entirely, operating in the shadows of the black market construction trade, which meant the house was now a legal minefield of unpermitted work. They were so confident in their deception that they didn't even notice me standing right behind them, invisible as always, holding the match that would eventually set their entire house of cards on fire. The scale of their deception was staggering, but my resolve was even stronger. Tonight, as the champagne continued to flow and the air became thick with Cora's exaggerated tales of her real estate prowess, I felt my phone buzz with a final confirmation from Gary Higgins. The message was brief and loaded with tension. "I'm at the gate. This guy Caleb isn't answering my calls, and the check for the materials just bounced. I need answers now." I stood up slowly, excusing myself from the table with a calm that felt like the eye of a hurricane, and walked out to the darkened driveway where Gary was pacing back and forth next to his truck. He looked exhausted, his hands stained with the dust of my grandmother's house, and his eyes narrowed as I approached him with a folder in my hand. I didn't waste time with small talk. I opened the folder and showed him the original deed to the property and the registration papers for H. Anchor LLC. Gary stared at the documents for a long minute, his jaw tightening as the realization hit him that he had been working for people who didn't own a single square inch of the dirt they were standing on. "You're telling me Caleb and Cora lied to my face for 6 months?" He growled, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. I told him the truth, that they had forged the signatures, lied about the trust, and were planning to leave him with a mountain of debt, while they fled, with whatever profit they could squeeze out. Gary looked at the house where the lights were bright, and the laughter was loud. Then, he looked back at me, and asked what I wanted him to do. I told him to walk through those front doors and demand his money in front of everyone, because the time for secret conversations was officially over. I followed Gary back inside, watching as the room fell silent the moment he stomped into the dining area, still covered in work clothes and smelling of cedar sawdust. Cora's smile froze on her face as Gary threw a crumpled copy of their forged contract onto the table right next to her expensive steak. "The materials check bounced, Cora, and I just found out from the real owner that you're nothing but a pair of con artists." Gary shouted, his voice echoing off the walls and making Dad jump in his seat. Caleb tried to stand up, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he stammered about a banking error. But Gary wasn't listening. He turned to me and pointed a calloused finger, telling the entire room that I was the one who had the deed and the one who had actually been paying the bills for a decade. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum of shock that sucked the air out of the room as Dad looked from me to Cora and then back to me again. I stood there at the end of the table, finally visible, finally heard, and finally in control of the narrative that had been stolen from me so many years ago. The mask of my family's perfection was finally slipping, and the ugliness beneath was impossible to ignore. The morning after the confrontation was a blur of flashing lights and stern voices as the Dare County Sheriff's deputies arrived to execute a search warrant on Cora and Caleb's home. It turned out that the forged power of attorney was just the tip of the iceberg, as detectives discovered a cache of fraudulent loan applications where they had attempted to use the beach house as collateral for a massive equity line. I sat in Dad's living room watching him pace back and forth with a look of utter devastation as he realized that his favorite daughter had been willing to leave him homeless to fund her vanity. Instead of apologizing, Dad turned his anger toward me, shouting that I was cruel and calculated for letting them get this far without warning them. "You should have protected your sister, Harlow. You should have told us you bought the house instead of playing these sick games." He screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. I didn't flinch. I simply reminded him that I had spent 10 years protecting him from his own failures and that Cora was 38 years old and fully responsible for her own felonies. Mom was weeping in the corner, begging me to use my real estate connections to get the charges dropped, but I told her that Gary Higgins had already filed a formal complaint for theft by deception. The logic of our family dynamic had always been that I was the sacrifice for Cora's success, but that contract had been shredded the moment she tried to sell the only place I ever loved. By noon, Cora and Caleb were being processed at the county jail facing multiple counts of forgery mortgage fraud and aggravated grand larceny. The local news had already picked up the story, labeling it a high society coastal scam, and the reputation Cora had worked so hard to build was incinerated in a matter of hours. I walked out of the house as Dad was still shouting insults at my back, realizing that no amount of truth would ever change his mind about who the good daughter was. It didn't matter anymore, because for the first time in my life, I didn't need his approval to know that I had done the right thing. I drove down to the beach house one last time, looking at the half-finished renovations and the piles of debris, and I felt a profound sense of relief that the lies were finally over. The house was a mess, but it was my mess, and I had the resources and the time to fix it properly, without anyone else's interference. I sent a final text to Sloane telling her that the transition was complete, and that I was officially severing all ties with the people who had treated my kindness as a weakness. There was no going back to the way things were, and as I watched the waves crash against the shore, I knew that the silence of the ocean was far more honest than anything my family had ever said to me. 2 weeks before the final sentencing, I was summoned to a mediation room at Vance's law office because Cora's defense attorney believed they could convince me to sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a symbolic restitution. Walking into that sterile, glass-walled room felt like entering a battlefield, where the weapons were only ink and paper. Cora sat across from me, looking haggard and stripped of her usual designer facade, her eyes red from crying but still flickering with that old spark of manipulative desperation. She reached across the mahogany table, trying to grab my hand, while sobbing about how family should always come first, and how a prison record would ruin her life forever. Caleb sat beside her, silent for once, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if he could disappear into the carpet. My father was there too, leaning against the wall, and staring at me with a mixture of cold resentment and silent pleading, waiting for me to play the role of the savior one last time. I waited until Cora finished her rehearsed speech about sisterly love before I opened my briefcase and pulled out a final stack of documents that even the police hadn't seen yet. These were the personal ledgers from the last 10 years, showing every single dollar I had spent to keep the roof over their heads while they mocked my boring life. I told them that the time for mercy had expired a decade ago when they chose greed over honesty. I made it clear that I would be testifying as a victim of identity theft and property fraud, and that no amount of family guilt would stop me from seeking the maximum penalty. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on their faces as they realized I was completely unshakable was the most honest moment we had ever shared as a family. I left that room without looking back, knowing that my loyalty to the truth was the only thing that could set me free. The weight of their expectations had been lifted, leaving only the cold, sharp reality of their consequences. 3 months after the final court hearing, the dust has finally settled on the wreckage of my former life, leaving me with a clarity I never thought possible. Cora and Caleb accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial, resulting in a mandatory 5-year sentence for Caleb and a heavy term of house arrest and massive restitution for Cora. They are now legally barred from ever contacting me again, a restraining order that provides more peace of mind than any luxury amenity ever could. My parents still refuse to speak to me, choosing to spend their remaining years bitter and defensive in their suburban home, but I have found new family in the community of Outer Banks residents who value integrity over appearance. Gary Higgins and I reached a fair settlement. I paid him for the legitimate work he performed and hired him to finish the project the right way, ensuring that every nail and plank meets the highest standards of safety and craftsmanship. The house is no longer a monument to my family's greed, but a sanctuary for my own future, a place where the air is clean and the truth is the only thing that matters. Looking back, I realize that my silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a form of endurance that allowed me to outlast the predators in my own circle. This journey has taught me that you cannot save people who are determined to drown themselves in their own vanity, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let them hit the bottom. I chose to prioritize the truth over a comfortable lie, and while the cost was my relationship with my biological family, the gain was my own soul. Thank you for listening to my story and standing by me through these difficult revelations. If you have ever felt invisible or been treated unfairly by those who were supposed to love you, I hope my story gives you the courage to stand your ground and trust your own worth. Silence can be a powerful shield, but when the time is right, never be afraid to let the truth speak with the volume of 1,000 storms. Please, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think I was too harsh on my sister? Or would you have done the same to protect your legacy? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to share these powerful life lessons together. Your support means the world to me, and I look forward to reading your perspectives and hearing your own stories of resilience. Every comment and like helps me reach more people who might be going